Welcome, everyone, to Cor Ecclesiae. We're going to make a couple of changes now. Instead of once a month for an hour, we're now going to do twice a month at half an hour. And we made this decision on the basis of the fact that so many of things are happening in the church and in the world that a month seems to be a long time before we can get to our, excuse me, level of informed commentary. So we're going to do it half hour every second Wednesday, which will go to podcast air on Friday, and then at the end of the month with the same time frame. It's the usual panel. Welcome to the new year. We've got Michelle Loris, who's the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences at Sacred Heart, Charlie Gillespie, who's Associate Dean of the School of Performing Arts, and Dan Rober, who is the Chair of the Department of Catholic Studies. They're our panelists. They're all professors in the Department of Catholic Studies. And my name is Michael Higgins, and I'm a Professor Emeritus at the university. What we're going to do now, though, is that as the new year began, many scholars and commentators talk about the beginning of the Leo papacy in real terms. Oh, we know that he's been pope for several months, but he's been in the process of completing projects initiated by his predecessor in the same way that Francis did with Benedict and Benedict with John Paul II. So now we're several months from his installation as Bishop of Rome, and he's now really charting his own course. And one of the ways in which he sent a powerful message was to convoke what is called a extraordinary consistory. Now, there are two kinds of consistories, the ordinary and extraordinary. We won't go into all the details around them, they're irrelevant. But what is important is to recognize that they are convocations of cardinals. So it's the College of Cardinals coming together for a specific purpose, sometimes for the creation of new cardinals, sometimes to address specific issues, financial crisis, the sex abuse crisis, etc. But in this instance, and this may be illustrative of the Leo style, he's called them together in a kind of synodal way for 2 days at the beginning of January, in which there were four topics. One dealing with the Evangelium Gaudium, the great programmatic work by Pope Francis. One dealing with Predicate Gaudium, which is the major document dealing with the restructuring of the Curia, one dealing with liturgy, and one dealing, of course, with the ever-abiding important issue of synodality. Leo made it very clear that it was not going to be possible to do all these topics in any way seriously over 2 days. So they alighted on two of them. And those two were the important ones in the Pope's mind. I think they were the priority, and the cardinals got to work. So that's the background. That's where we are. First extraordinary consistory. Michelle, tell us what your impression is. Is this something new with Leo? What does he have in mind in your view?
So I think Leo is following, the extending Vatican II, following Francis, following Saint Augustine. He answered those questions that he put forth at the end of the consistory. If the church is to have new life, what is it going to be? And so I think he answers the question, what is the church to do? What's its mission? And how is it going to do it? And when he answers the question, what is its mission? He brings in Lumen Gentium, the Epiphany. He brings in the quote from Isaiah. The church's job is to bring the light of Christ to the darkness of the world. And it does that through attraction. And the attraction is attraction to Christ's love. And then he ties in Dilexit Nos and Evangelium Gaudium to say that it's Christ's love that the church has to bring to this dark world. That's the light, right? And how's the church to do it? As you mentioned, Michael, through synodality. That's the new way the church will be church, through dialogue, through listening, through encountering with love. And I think, Leo, with this consistory, set forth even before the cardinals chose Evangelium Gaudium and chose synodality. I think in his opening remarks, that's what he was telling us. What must the church do and how must the church do it?
Good. Thank you. Charlie.
Yeah, I think Michelle laid out the stakes of this extraordinary consistory incredibly well. What I would double down on and echo is I think what we saw from Pope Leo is the opportunity for the church to recognize that synodality is an authentic implementation of the Second Vatican Council. After this extraordinary consistory, I think it's possible to say that synodality is the chosen authentic implementation of the Second Vatican Council. And I'm extraordinarily excited to see that that was endorsed not only from the Pope in continuity with his predecessor, but also because those topics were chosen by the cardinals. We've seen an endorsement that continuing conversations about synodality in a synodal way, emphasizing listening, is something that the world needs in church leadership. And it is not simply about crossing boundaries and lines to hear voices we haven't heard before. Of course, synodality is that, but it's also listening for a way to bring the joy of the gospel to the world in light of the signs of the times for what the world needs right now. And I think that's the very theme of attraction that Michelle brought out in that beautiful commentary from the Pope before the beginning of the consistory that included the only footnoted reference to Hans Urs von Balthasar's notion that love, the love of Christ, alone is credible. I can't wait to see what this direction for church leadership takes all of us.
What about a footnote referring to your new book?
Maybe next time for the extraordinary consistory on musicals.
That's what I was looking forward to. Dan.
So I think what I'd like to do is situate a little bit why would Pope Leo call the College of Cardinals specifically together, right? What is it about this group, and why did Francis not do this? Um, and I think there's a couple of things we can kind of glean from this. One, obviously, at the conclave, the College of Cardinals in the pre-conclave meetings and the post-conclave discussions were desirous of such a thing, right? They wanted to have more meetings together than they were having in the past. And in my experience running an academic department, I can say that when a group wants to have more meetings, this is usually actually a pretty healthy sign, right? Of their collegiality, of their desire to work together. Um, Francis famously, rather than calling the college together frequently, had what he was called the C9, right? His kind of group of cardinals that he trusted. In some cases, whether or not he should have trusted them, right? But he had this kind of like kitchen cabinet model. And for a couple of reasons, I think Francis understood very clearly that his election was very much contingent on the fact of Pope Benedict's resignation and the kind of openness to new things that invited into the 2013 conclave. And whereas after that, there was a lot of buyer's remorse within the College of Cardinals about the election of Pope Francis, with cardinals signing on to dubia, right? Cardinals, again, including one of the cardinals who his initial C9, right? Kind of, raying anonymous diatribes against Francis. So I think he had a desire to kind of keep a bit of a distance from the college as such, while reshaping it with his own picks, right? With his own people. And by the time the college had been kind of thoroughly reshaped, I think Francis, what energy he had was more focused on the synods, was more focused on carrying that out than on trying to establish a rapport with the College of Cardinals, which was very much gearing up to elect a new pope. But of course, one of their complaints was that they didn't know each other. Leo, I think, looking at a somewhat longer pontificate than Francis, most likely, and also looking at not nearly the level of opposition to his own person within the college out of the gate, I think wants to draw upon the College of Cardinals on the whole as an advisory body, rather than kind of keep this kind of distance. So I think that's positive, and I think centering Evangelii Gaudium couldn't be any clearer in terms of the continuity of trajectory with Francis, right? That document, if anything, I think became underrated in the later years of Francis's pontificate because of other things that came out like Laudato Si. But Evangelii Gaudium was the mandate. It was the constitution, essentially, of Francis's pontificate. So to keep returning to that as an echo of Vatican II is placing the approach of Francis as a definitive interpretation and reception of Vatican II. And I think that's very important to keep in mind that he would bring that document forward, which if he had wanted to, he could have very easily moved on from, given that it's 13 years old, right? And given that other things have happened since then. But going back to that document, I think signals that Leo wants to continue the overall agenda of Francis.
I think that's right, Dan. I think that we have a very clear demonstration of Leo's commitment not only to synodality and in many ways the Francis agenda, but very importantly, the return to the council. This is going to be a major component. He's made this clear in terms of his pontifical catecheses, that they're going to be going back, doing a kind of living ressourcement of the documents of the council. But here's why I want to, before we leave this topic, I want to just go back quickly and do a follow-up with the three of you. And that is this. Dan, of course, is quite right. Francis created the Council of Cardinals, and it was a limited body, but they were basically his allies. Benedict had a very small inner cabinet. John Paul ran the whole operation solo. So when you come to Leo, there seems to be an expansion of this, right? And so the College of Cardinals now is an extra step of inclusion and governance. But there was an article published by Thomas Rees, the Jesuit political scientist with whom you are all familiar, and it's kind of provocative. Just appeared yesterday. He says, until we see what Leo's plans are for the synod, we will not know whether he prefers synodality with or without the laity. Never underestimate the ability of clericalism to triumph in the Catholic Church. Now, that seems like a sour note. He goes on, because this is classic Rees, to say he does seem to be interested in not returning to the past, Leo, and he hopes for a creative church full of life. So, and in a way, Rees answers his own query, but the query is unsettling for him, and I suspect for many of us. For Francis, synodality had a very strong laity component. Now, the synodal method modeled in the College of Cardinals is sans laity. There are no laity. Is Rees reacting, do you think, nervously? Do you see the possibility of the synod or the consistory becoming just the men's club in discussion with the Pope? What do you think? Go back to you, Michelle, and then we'll go through the three of you.
Yes. It's it's hard for me right now to know whether, I mean, his meeting of the consistory, he's already called a meeting that there will be one in June, and that may remain cardinals only, but I don't think synodality in general will just be the clerics. There are too many cardinals in that consistory. You remember Supich and McElroy, when they came back from the first synod on synodality, said it's not possible to continue synodality without the laity. There were articles about both of them saying that, and I don't think they're the only two cardinals, and we know Supich has a lot of influence and power. And I think Leo himself, when he was in Peru, had synodality very much with the laity, and there are articles talking about the kinds of things that he affected in conjunction with the laity while he was in Peru. So I don't think there can be synodality. There can't be a new way of being church, of being a synodal church, without including men and women, without including laity and clergy. While I'm always suspicious of clericalism, I am hopeful that Leo will be aware of that.
Okay, good. Charlie.
I think Thomas Rees is raising a really important and striking question, and it leads me to want to make a distinction between synodality as a reception of the Second Vatican Council and synodality as a structure. I do think that the Synod on synodality very importantly ensured lay participation at every stage of the process. I'm not entirely sure that a synodal approach to the College of Cardinals necessarily would include the laity. The caution, the anxiety is real because both clericalism and patriarchal misogyny tend to be governing ideologies of the church when it strays from talking about the joy of the gospel and allowing love to be the standard of credibility. With that said, I'm excited to see the model of collegiality of the church's hierarchy then indicate if the Pope in Rome can listen to the voices of the cardinal advisors from all over the planet, so too should every parish pastor, so too should every diocesan bishop, so too should every Catholic organization that embraces the fact that synodality is a way to have the good of order structured sometimes as hierarchy without allowing that to deform our desire to be an obsession with hierarchical order and losing the common good. That's a little technical, but I think that's why I'm inspired by the College of Cardinals proceeding to the synodal method in the audience chamber. And I'm not worried that there were not lay people amongst the College of Cardinals, because at present, the category of the lay cardinal is an oxymoron.
Dan.
To pick up on what Charlie just said, right? The possibility of reform of the College of Cardinals to include non-clerics is, I think, quite live, because there is no theological basis for the College of Cardinals. So that in and of itself is an important question. I think, of course, clericalism is always something we need to be concerned about. I will note, again, we have the second straight religious order pope. Clericalism certainly exists in religious orders, but it takes a different form than it does among the diocesan clergy. So I'll just quote from Paul Eli's reported piece on Leo in Peru. And he was quoting an email sent by Leo as Pope saying, "I'm just 6 weeks into this new mission." And I think that's a really interesting insight into how Leo views the papacy, right? As kind of his final mission, right? As the final thing to which he has been assigned by the church to do, which is a little different than the clericalist mentality, which is, this is the kind of appointment I've worked my whole life to get, the sinecure that I've been waiting for. So I think Leo is somebody who asks the question, does this serve the mission, right? How does this serve the mission of the church? And again, I think as somebody whose task is very much the routinization of Francis's charism, right? Leo needs to address the different constituencies of the church and think about how they are serving the mission of the church. And the College of Cardinals is one of those constituencies, as is the Curia, right? Which Leo has also tried to take a gentler approach to than did Francis, right? These are constituencies of the church that, to some degree or another, are serving the mission of the church, but need to be continually reformed in order to serve the mission of the church. So I think it's appropriate that he does that consultation. But I think, again, to echo what Michelle said, everything about Prevost's career or missions leading up to becoming pope indicates somebody who collaborates well with the laity, both men and women, and will continue to do so. And I think has a keen sense that, right, to quote Newman, right, that the church would look silly without them, right, and that further collaboration and inclusion is the only thing that makes sense going forward.
If Francis had followed my advice and created the sister, Angelina, I think it was, if I get the name right, a cardinal, along with Timothy Ratcliffe, the two great spiritual architects of the synod, he would have established the precedent that Paul VI seriously thought about with the creation of Jacques Maritain as the first lay cardinal. None of them followed through on this, and I think I think maybe with Leo we might actually see that. All right, we only have a few minutes left, but I need to bring this up, and that's the question of right in the middle of all of this. What does Leo find himself in? A situation of great war, bellicosity, division, and violence. Well, these are characteristics of daily life, it would appear, but they received a heightened dimension during that first week. The removal of the president and his wife from Caracas by U.S. troops, further bellicosity in relation to Greenland and Colombia and perhaps even Panama, would suggest that we're in yet another new stage. And Leo is not unaware of this. He said at one point that war is back in vogue. That's pretty powerful language, I think, and he had specifically a few things in mind. When you think of pontificates that begin in world crises, Benedict XV beginning his papacy in 1914, the beginning of World War I. Eugenio Pacelli beginning his papacy as Pius XII in 1939, following the invasion of Poland. You see with Leo, here he is establishing his papacy, and already he has this warlike world almost unhinged. So, with regard to Venezuela, there are many interesting points. First of all, Michago, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, has met with the Pope this week. Cardinal Parolin served as nuncio in Caracas for many years. The Sostituto, Archbishop Peña Parera, is Venezuelan. So there has been a lot of deep concern. And of course, Leo himself lived in Latin America for a couple of decades. There's a lot of concern with what is happening in Venezuela. Is it a presage of greater global disaster? Hence his comment, war appears to be in vogue. How do you read Leo's response to the Venezuela crisis, which is ongoing, of course? But by the time we finish this podcast, everything may have changed or changed subtly. But situated now, how do you read the challenge facing Leo? Michelle.
I think Leo's his remarks, his address to the diplomatic corps, I think he situates himself. He frames that conversation with St. Augustine's City of God and the sack of Rome. And he talks about war being in vogue, trampling the rule of law, violating human dignity. And he talks about how the earthly leaders are just filled with self-love, seeking out their own glory, their own power, using Orwellian language to attack their opponents, their freedom of conscience, their freedom of speech. And in all of those remarks, it seems to me he is paralleling, right, St. Augustine, the City of God, the moral voice in the darkness of the sack of Rome, leaders who are corrupt. And so he's a moral voice. And for me, it was interesting because I had just read Donald Trump's interview with New York Times, where he said the only morality that counted was his own morality, and that was the only morality that would restrain him. And, we're seeing the things that are happening in the United States, right? And not just Venezuela, which Leo has certainly said its sovereignty should be secured, its imprisoned people should be released, etc. But in the United States, we see people like Renee Good being shot and Orwellian language being used to discuss that whole assault. And so I think Leo is setting him up himself, has situated himself as the only statesman who has a moral voice. And he's talking, and he parallels himself with St. Augustine, if you will, in the Sack of Rome.
Okay, thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left in the program, Charlie.
So I love you bringing our attention to this quote, Michael, because I think it's showing that Pope Leo, to echo Michelle, wants to be a moral voice in this moment. When Pope Leo said war is back in vogue, one of the ways he glossed it immediately is to say a zeal for war is spreading. And I think the shortest comment I want to make that I think is important is that Pope Leo's discussions about the rule of law and his invocations of St. Augustine are an implicit reminder that we might see become more explicit, that Augustine is also one of the architects of Catholic just war theory. What does it mean to think about the fact that a fallen world is going to at times fall into conflict as tragedy in our rejection of the God of love? And one of the other things that Pope Leo said is that in our moment, peace is no longer sought as a gift and a desirable good in itself. Instead, peace becomes sought through weapons as a condition of one's own dominion. And that's a threat to the rule of law. There's something I think Pope Leo is inviting us to think about in all of our geopolitical conflicts, including what's going on in Venezuela with the United States, around where do we value law and agreement as the foundation for peaceful coexistence to move our conflicts to other arenas rather than through arms.
Thanks, Charlie. Dan, you have the final comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to point just to Pope Leo's emphasis on multilateralism in his comments, right? That's really important because especially because it's very much directly contradicting the kind of meme lords in the Trump administration, including the vice president, right? The Catholic vice president, who want to basically just try to treat, the post-war consensus, right, of the hard-earned post-war consensus in millions of lives lost as some kind of luxury belief. In fact, their belief that you can, get away with regime change without bloodshed is a luxury belief that is going to be proven catastrophically wrong sooner rather than later. So I think Leo, again, building on a lot of what Pope Francis accomplished, has internalized a lot of those lessons. During the conclave, I said one of the reasons I thought Cardinal Parolin, who we saw, right, he has certain diplomatic skills which are useful, but would not make a good pope is you need somebody who can get at least to the level of Paul VI at the UN, saying never again war. And Leo has he quoted that the first week of his papacy, basically. Right. But he has very much internalized those things. And again, as somebody coming from the United States, and I've said this before in this forum, he has zero illusions about what he's dealing with. Right. He has zero naivete about what he's dealing with and the kind of people he's dealing with. And I think that's enormously helpful at this particular moment.
I'm glad you echoed that wonderful line, war, never again, war, that Paul VI said when he visited the United States in the mid-1960s. It does seem to be in some important ways, not only in appearance, but in manner and temperament. He seems to channel Leo very much the Montini persona. And there's much to be said for that. We're going to come back in 2 weeks' time to look at some new issues with Pope Leo and the church at large and in the world. We encourage those of you who are watching us, maybe for the first time, or are consistent viewers, to encourage friends and others to access our program. It's easy enough to do. We're happy to provide that as a source. This is an important forum for commentary and indeed a kind of an accelerator of intelligent reflection on the nature of the church and the world in a particularly tremulous times. Thank you for being with us. and we'll see you in 2 weeks.